Hey, and welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We are on week 69 together. We're going to be finishing up the book of Judges. I cannot believe it. This is our 8th book to complete together.
I'm not sure how we got here, but
I know.
little by little, I guess. But last three chapters of Judges are really action-packed. I can't wait to dig in.
Yeah, me too. So we're going to be in Judges 19, 20, and 21 as we finish up. You're going to read Psalm 69 this week, and we're in John chapter 2. We're going back into John, the Gospel of John.
Boy, we thought last week was packed. We got another action-packed few verses. John 2 is shorter, but it's not less material.
I agree. We were talking about in our pre-talk, like, how are we going to talk about it all?
Yeah.
It's going to be one of those
Hopefully
days.
we can keep it to a more decent length. We're trying to keep these under 40 or 45 minutes, but it's been very challenging.
I have to cut quite a bit to keep it there, to be honest. Our conversations are rich. I do cut a lot of things that we talk about because we're trying to keep them within that reasonable. Yeah, it's hard some days.
Should we dig in and try to limit your editing?
What you're saying is, Amber, stop pre-talking and let's just get to it.
Let's just jump right in.
Let's do it. All right, so we're going to be starting Judges chapter 19. So we introduce another Levite. Another Levite's introduced, and he's wandering once again. It's almost as if these Levites now here lately don't feel like they have much of a purpose, which seemed fascinating to me because out of all the tribes, I feel like the Levites had the most purpose. Like they're in charge of the temple and the sacrifices and things like that, and here they're wandering, unsure what to do.
They were supposed to be the tribe of Israel that put God on display to intercede on behalf of the rest of Israel with God, just like Israel as a nation was supposed to put God on display to the other nations. And just like Israel's fallen and is not putting God on display at all, neither of the Levites fulfilling their purpose.
Yeah, that is well put for sure. And I think that's why it's here. Like, well, why are we into Judges, the book of Judges, without any more judges? Like, the last several chapters, there's no judges. So what's the purpose of it?
It felt more like an epilogue to a book. Like, in a book, you get the ending chapters that kind of close out the story, and then some books will have, either history or fiction, will have an epilogue that say, because the story happened, these are the consequences that flowed through time. I
think it's exactly what we see here. We see a book full of judges, of leaders, military leaders, some that act like kings and some who were just military based. They all fail miserably. In fact, they seem to get worse. They seem to get more unholy as you go. And the rest of this book, this epilogue, as you kind of call it, is these other groups of people in Israel. We have Levites who represent the priestly side or the holy side. Like you said, they're supposed to be elevating God. And then we have groups of like individual people group, like maybe a household of people. And then we see tribes of people, all people being affected by these judges.
Yeah, the leaders have lost their way, and that's filtering down into the ways of the people.
Yeah, and in our pre-talk, we kind of said it reminds us that we're still living in that epilogue, if you will, today.
Absolutely. I think we've been living in that epilogue since the fall in Genesis 3, right? And the sin has entered the world, and so death has entered the world, and God gave the law at Mount Sinai to help us understand that. And when we realized that the law wasn't going to lead to life, he sent in Jesus. So now we're living in a better epilogue than even before Jesus' time, but it's still being worked out.
It is.
And we know the ending in Revelation, but we've got to continue working that out and fighting the struggle to make the story end up where it should be.
You're right, and it's interesting as you relate it to the original sin. It's interesting how the book of Judges here at the end, it keeps mentioning how everyone's just doing what's right in their own eyes. Yeah. It's a total callback to that original sin where Eve saw what was desirable in her own eyes. That apple to her eyes looked desirable to eat, and she thought, I'm going to take that for myself. And there's still the same nature, human nature of doing what's right in their own eyes, is what we still see here, and it says it over and over again here in Judges.
And we saw this in Samson when he was blinded, right? We talked about how his eyes were his weakness. He was so far apart from the ways of God, so far apart from seeing God face to face, which, the language of the Bible is God by seeing him face to face. And the early church fathers talked about that, right? And from that sense, Samson was so totally turned from God. He just saw things his own way. He just saw things out of the way the world sees him.
Yeah.
And he was blinded, literally, spiritually, and then physically he was blinded.
Yeah.
But Israel itself, through these stories, to your point, all the people, groups, and aspects of the nation's life that they're showing in these last chapters of Judges are showing how Israel itself is blind. They're doing what's right in their own eyes, because they're spiritually blind to the ways of God. They're so far apart from the ways of God, they only see the way that the world would have them see things.
Yeah, and so we're going to see a group of people. This story here is specifically about a Levite, where he is looking for his concubine. She's left him. She went back home. It says, our translation here in the ESV says unfaithful. I think the NIV said unfaithful as well. But it might be better translated as angry with.
Well, the message, we looked this up, the Message translation says she quarreled with.
Quarreled.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a better translation.
Yeah.
If you read into the text, you kind of read what's going on here. It seems like he's probably the one at fault here, especially because you see him, he's going to his father-in-law's house and he's hoping she'll come back. And you're like, oh, clearly he's in the wrong.
Yeah,
he's the one in the wrong.
Plus the way he acts later, I think it gives away his character is really flawed.
Right. I mean, that's clear in the story later. So here he come to this father-in-law's house and she takes him in. The father-in-law takes him in as well. And not only that, but he kind of doesn't want him to leave.
You have this excessive show of hospitality. I'm like, dude, let him go. He's like, clearly the Levite and his concubine feel like they overstayed their welcome. They're like, please let us go. It's time for us to go.
Yeah.
It's like grandma won't let you leave her house.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how our own experiences, sometimes we wear a lens, our own personal lens as we enter scripture. Yeah. And so my personality, as I'm reading this, I'm already a little like, something's up here. Yeah. This is not going to go well. Exactly. And I'm like, I kept looking for the father-in-law was the one that was maybe the one that was up to no good. And it ended up that's not the case at all. I was so wrong as I was reading it. Yeah. He's the one that's, I think the scripture, the narrator is trying to go over and beyond to make us realize that it's about his amazing hospitality, because we're going to see the opposite of that come next. I think it's the point. It's
a compare and contrast. Yes. Like, here's what radical hospitality looked like.
Yes.
Because you're about to see a radical lack of hospitality from the very people, the Benjamites in Gibeah, who should know how to treat people because they're the people of God.
Exactly. So they finally do leave, and it's later in the day. They left later than they wanted to, and it's later in the day, and they first come up to this town that's not a Israelite town. It is a Canaanite town.
Jebus in verse 10.
Yeah, and it's almost like you're supposed to get this sense. I think as the reader, you're supposed to get this sense like, ooh, it's not safe to stay there. Yeah. It's not safe to say that we got to move on. And so then you go on, and they finally make it to an Israelite town. They make it to Gibeah.
Yeah.
I always say it wrong. They made it to Gibeah, and when they make it there, it's almost like, as I was reading, I'm supposed to go, whew, they made it somewhere safe before dark.
Because this is an Israelite town, and like we said, they will know how to show hospitality.
Much like the father-in-law did, right? That's what we're supposed to imagine. And then that is not quite what happens, is it?
It's interesting in verse 14, it says, so they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. The sun went down language is very fascinating to me, because this sense of darkness as they go into the Israelite town compared to the light of day that they had before them.
Yeah.
But the sun's going down, and they're about to enter a very dark time.
I think the language is definitely intentional. Yeah. Not only are we supposed to imagine that they barely made it before dark, but I think you're supposed to also be like, oh, there's some darkness happening even within these Israelite towns. And then so no one would take them in to the square. They went to the square. That's what you're supposed to do. Like, if you're a traveler, they don't have inns in these little small towns. Only really, really big cities would have an inn of some sort.
By the way, on that note, I wrote, no one would take them in verse 15. The expression in Hebrew is en. Actually, apostrophe en is how they transliterate. But it means there was no. That's kind of the direct translation. Mm-hmm. And we kind of fill it out in our translations, there was no man who would take them in. But this is the same language as we've seen throughout Judges. There was no king in those days.
Right.
And that just reinforces the reason why the Israelites were doing what was right in their own eyes, because there was no king, even though God should have been their king. Right. Like, God was their king, and they were so divorced from him, they weren't treating him as their king.
Right. That's a good point. I didn't catch that at all. So you see that already this town is supposed to be kind of like, oh, they're not so friendly. But this one older man coming back through town, stops and says, oh, who are you? Where are you going? How can I help?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he has him, and he takes him into his home. But then something shifts in this next part of the story.
Man, I almost felt like I'd read that story before.
It does sound really familiar, doesn't it? I think that's
It does.
intentional as well.
Yeah.
Before we do enter this part of the story, this from here for the next several minutes, I would say from about 10 minutes or so, I would give a trigger warning. There's some of the language is violent, some of it is abusive by nature, sexual at nature. So if you could be triggered, just a trigger warning, maybe speed it up and skip ahead about 10 minutes or so, just in case. We want to throw that out there before we enter this conversation.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you fast forward, we're still talking about Judges 19. You probably want to fast forward more. Yeah.
Keep going.
So as I said, this story, when I read it, I felt like I'd read it before, and it's very, we have, right? I mean, in Genesis 19, we read where Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, but especially the Sodom story of how Lot was treated along with his daughter.
Yeah, because he took in the angels.
Right.
The two men.
Right.
Who were described as angels. He
Right.
took them in, and then they came out and they wanted, give me that man that looks so that really
Looks appealing.
Those two really appealing looking men.
They look
Send
good
them
to
out
our
to
eyes
us.
almost,
They,
kind of
I think
another-
that is sort of exactly right.
Yeah.
Send them out to us. So why would they send them out to them? What's the point of that?
So from a Hebrew ancient Near East perspective, hospitality and providing protection to somebody you've taken into your house is the utmost value, right? So when Lot sends his daughter out, as opposed to the men, he's showing he's kind of honoring the protection he owes to the men.
Yeah.
So that's why he sends his daughter out, and women are valued less than men in that society anyway, because it was patriarchal. But we see that's exactly what happens here in Judges, in this Judges 19 story.
It's almost identical.
Yeah, the Levite sends his concubine out to the guys. The old man is protecting the Levite because he's taking him into his house, and so they send the concubine out instead.
Yeah, he sends his, and it says that the Levite sent out his concubine, basically to save his own neck.
Yeah.
Is what he does. So my question is, these men who are basically demanding for this other man, for the Levite to come out, is this because there's a hope these guys are like all about gay sex? What's happening here, Craig? It's not what it's about.
Yeah,
what's happening here in this story? Like, what's the purpose of them asking them to come out?
They're asking them to come out so they can show power and domination.
Yes.
Right. It's a power play.
Yes.
It's about because they want to add to their conquests, right? In that sense, they will increase their possessions from that sense too, even if it's a possession of experience,
Right.
Or an experience of possession. So from that perspective, it's not so much different from us today in our politics and how things play out in our own society. It's all very much about power and domination, and this zero-sum game mindset that people get in their mind that in order to advance in life, I have to step on somebody else.
Yeah. I actually thought of like movies that we see nowadays of like maybe prison, where you're the new guy comes in and the new guy gets maybe he gets abused.
Yeah.
And the reason why is not because the other men in the prison who's been there longer are gay. It's because they're showing, nope, we own this place. It's our power, our dominance. You're the new guy. You belong to us.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is the mindset we're supposed to imagine here. They're just saying you don't belong here. We're over you. You have no power here.
1,000 or 1,500 years into the future of Judges, where you see that exactly play out in the Greek and Roman culture. Sexual exploitation was very much a shame/power move.
Yeah.
The higher class people would shame in that way the lower class people, especially slaves at the time.
Yeah.
So it was very much a domination game.
So that's what's happening here. So he sends out his concubine instead so he would be safe. And it kind of is really graphic of what happens, but afterwards, you see this image of her on her hands, kind of reaching out with her arms on the threshold of the door of her husband.
She's obviously near death already. She's very weak, depleted. She's been used all night. She's at the threshold, reaching out, pleading for help.
Pleading for help. And I wrote down this note that you almost see this desperation of her hands reached out, asking for salvation, asking for help. And remember, the Levites, specifically the priest, are supposed to be these placeholders of what Jesus is going to be like. Yeah. And we reach out our hands and ask for Jesus for salvation, and he's going to give it salvation. Here we see the opposite. Here we don't even see any compassion at all. Not only does he not save her, he actually turns around and goes, just get up, woman, let's go. Yeah. And there's like zero compassion for what's happened. And so,
well, not only are they supposed to be a placeholder for Jesus, they're supposed to be administering the sacrifices on behalf of the people.
Sure, yes.
Well, and I just say that because now he ends up sacrificing her in a way.
He does.
Instead of sacrificing animals, now he's sacrificing her.
Yeah.
Literally.
It's jacked up.
He carves her in parts and sends her out.
To the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
He does.
It's very disturbing. So, and I just have the sense of, like, she's still a person, and he treats her this way. In verse 29, it says she was. It says what happens to her, but it still refers to her as her. And in the middle of even what is happening to her, God refuses to let go of her personhood and her humanity.
Wow! Instead of saying like using a different word, it uses the word her as a whole person.
Yes.
Even still.
Yes.
I think you said that in our pre-talk, and I thought that was really moving. I did not see that, and I love that God's word is beautiful enough to keep her as a person.
Even
here.
in the midst of our ugliest sins and our ugliest dehumanization of each other, God is still going to insist on who we are.
Yeah.
Insist on the value of us and worth of us as humans.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you point that out for us.
Thanks.
Thank you for doing that. Chapter 20 basically is the next part of the same story.
Yep.
So now we have...
And by the way, 19 through 21 are all part of the same story.
Yeah, they're all connected.
I'm not sure we said that, just to help connect the dots.
So as we enter 20, so all of a sudden this is all the people of Israel coming from Dan, which is the far north side. And then I said, you're the Mr. Maps guy. You have a map for this? We'll find you a map for that. Dan is the most northern part of the Promised Land, and then Beersheba is the farthest south. And so basically what it's trying to image for you is that all the people of Israel came out, all of them, top to bottom, left and right, and basically they're all there to come out for what happened. And you're like, wait a second, they're all unified again all of a sudden? We haven't seen them being unified for God's will this whole book of Judges so far.
I literally wrote this. It isn't God that reunites the people of Israel. At the end of the book of Judges, a grisly act of violence that violates shalom is what brings Israel together.
It's interesting that this whole entire book we keep pointing out, like even in Deborah's like, I blew the horn. God's will was for us all to come and do this together.
They all didn't come.
And you didn't come, and you're cursed because of it. And after that, you see less and less people coming out for the call of God's will. Here, God isn't called, it's not his will at all.
God's nowhere in here.
He's nowhere in here. and here they all come together, and they're unified so much that it's described as everybody. Yeah. And they come out, and they basically say what happened, and they only get one person's story. They get the Levite's story. But do you think that's the right thing for them to do, or is there something missing here?
They didn't ask God what they should do.
Well, they definitely didn't ask God.
Well, plus back in the Levitical code, you're supposed to have more than one witness to an incident for it to be legally binding.
Exactly right. I think I wrote down some notes what was said in Leviticus. Let me see if I can find those real fast. I think it's in Deuteronomy. Oh. Deuteronomy 13, 12 through 19. You have to find evidence. You have to have 2 or more witnesses with evidence, and then you have to stand trial. Do you see any of those things happening?
Now, if they just hear the guy's testimony, which, by the way, is
not fully
a little bit
true.
Embellished.
Right. Lacking some information.
It says he was going to be violated. He was in danger, which kind of he was, but he was the man. He should have stood up for himself. Yeah. At least from our perspective.
Right.
And then he says that she was dead before he took her and sent her across the country. The text in 19 never says she was dead before he got a hold of her.
It intentionally leaves that out. We don't know if she is or isn't.
Yeah, but you're right. The text never confirms that on purpose. Right.
On purpose. And here he just kind of like, and she was already dead, but who no witness.
Right.
Right? That's the point. There's no witness here. And so they make up their mind that this guy's right, despite that they didn't do the Deuteronomy 13 thing.
Then they don't ask God what they should do.
They don't ask him. That's what I'm going to say. They basically say, we're going to go kill him, so who should go first? And
Judah.
Judah should go first. So God responds.
That was God's answer.
Yeah, God responds Judah. Well, why does he respond Judah? I thought this is interesting. You're like, wait a second. Is God saying this is okay?
Well, that was honestly my first reaction when I read through this the first time.
Yeah, well, I did a little digging, and I found out that in Judges 1, it actually, the same thing happens. They ask God, what should we do? Who should go first? They ask his permission, and then they say, who should go first? And he says, Judah. Here, they don't ask his permission, but they do say who should go first. So he's like, Judah. Judah always goes first.
Yeah.
Always.
Judah's always in the lead, no matter what.
If you ask me this for any scenario, my answer is going to be Judah goes first. Send Judah.
But you didn't ask me.
But you didn't ask me if you should do it. You just said, I'm going to do it. Who should go first? The answer is always Judah. So pay attention what was not asked. I think that's really important.
It's interesting all throughout Judges and Joshua, or I should say Joshua and Judges. It's interesting what God doesn't say as much as it is interesting what God does say.
Right. Exactly.
I think you really have to pay attention to that in all these books.
We've been mentioning that a few times the last several weeks.
We'll call it out.
Pay attention to what is not said sometimes, and who is speaking, who's not speaking. It's really, really.
But it's important as Christians for us to understand that, because non-believers and people who want to tear down Christianity and the Bible will blame things on God for things that he didn't say or take responsibility for in the text.
All the time. That is 100% true.
Don't let people twist that around.
Well, the enemy likes to twist it just enough, and I think that's what's happening.
Yep.
So then you see these 700 chosen men. I wrote down 700 or 007.
Oh, 007.
Ooh, it is
James Bond.
Exactly. The little James Bond. These are my James Bond. I said the James Bond fighters is what I wrote down.
I like it.
And I said, they come out, and surely they obviously have the upper hand. Clearly they have the upper hand, right? Not only that, but God did say to send Judah first.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Do they destroy?
Get their clocks clean.
They get... It's embarrassing.
The Benjamites wiped the floor with them.
They sure did. I thought it was really funny. I actually kind of laughed.
Kind of was.
And I said I laughed. In my notes, I wrote down, I'm confused. I said, I'm confused.
So you didn't laugh, you scratched your head.
I went, what's going on here? And then I said, oh, it's because did they ever ask him that they should have attacked to begin with? They never asked him.
That's kind of why I started putting the first pieces together. I'm like, wait, if God was behind this and they were working with his will, they would have won.
Exactly.
Because Israel's defeat is indicative of sin.
Yes.
National sin in particular. And so then they have to repent, send up burnt offerings and peace offerings in verse 26. And then it was interesting. They said they're going to inquire of the Lord and send Phinehas. Yeah. Well, we've seen him before.
Yes. Isn't Phinehas the one at the very end of Joshua?
Yeah.
Where you have the 3.5 tribes. They help their brothers conquer their land, and then they get permission to go back to their side of their families. Yep. And as they go, they build this thing that looks just like the temple, the tabernacle, right? Yep. And Israel gets all up in arms, and they're about to go kill everybody.
Because they set up a second tabernacle to compete with the real one.
Right.
So we got to wipe them out because we saw what happened when we commit idolatry to God.
Right. Yeah, they were trying to be. Yeah, they're
actually trying to be faithful.
They were trying to be faithful. Yeah. They're like, we're just gonna wipe them all out. So they go and they're gonna kill them all. And Phinehas is like, wait a second. Maybe we should ask them why they did that for.
That's always a thought.
Yeah.
What? Hey, person who I don't understand, what are you thinking?
Yeah, it's thank you, Phinehas. Yeah. And so they're like, and then he comes back and he goes, oh, we're fine. They built it as a memorial because they don't get to see it, and they want their kids to know that they've seen it before, like they've actually seen it with their own 2 eyes, since they don't get to see it. So they wrote it. They made it as a memorial. They're not actually going to use it like a real sacrifice. So we're good. We're clear. Right. And then because of Phinehas, those 3.5 tribes are not wiped off, not utterly destroyed. Right. Here, it's no accident that the Phinehas is mentioned because the exact same situation is happening. They are rushing to conclusion. They're wanting to wipe someone completely off without God's approval, without God really saying, should I do this? Yes, go ahead. And then without asking first. So it's kind of like, it's like this mention on purpose. Like, this is what not to do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it's also interesting that Phinehas is listed as the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron. That could be confusing. We talked a couple 3 weeks ago about the timeline of Joshua and Judges, and we said there was about, I think, 250 or 300 years duration between the conquest and this point at the end of Judges when we'll see Samuel come up when we get to 1 Samuel. But this is, if Phinehas is the literal grandson of Aaron, that's what, 3 generations? That might be 100, 150 years at the most. So the Hebrew words here for son of, keep in mind, doesn't, that sometimes they skip generations and still say son of.
Yeah, it doesn't tell us how many sons.
Right.
It just he is the son. He's in the same line.
It's a little bit more liberal in the use of son of than we might be in our Western culture
Certainly.
context. So just keep that in mind.
I'm glad you said that because when I read it, I just in my brain I thought, oh, he's just in the line of. And when you said it, like this could be confusing. I'm so glad you brought that out because it could be confusing.
Yep.
I just think we're supposed to imagine this is in the line of.
Right.
Yeah. Very good. And so finally they repent, and then they ask God for what they should do, and God gives them permission to go ahead, and there is justice to be had.
Right.
What happened was wrong.
Yeah.
Justice needed to be happen, but we need to do it on God's terms, not our own terms.
Yep.
And so then God tells them, "Well, I'll be with you," and they go and they win.
Mm-hmm.
They get victory. But then they go on and do more. I feel like they go over and beyond what God actually wanted of them. He said, I'll be with you to give them into their hands.
Yeah.
And then later it describes this battle for us. And at the end, it talks about how they just basically killed everyone, leaving 600 men. They basically wiped out all the girls, all the children, all the animals. They burned the place down. God didn't tell them that.
They literally almost commit genocide against the tribe of Benjamin.
That's not what God told them to
Yeah.
do.
And then they lament it, right?
Yeah.
It's like they do this bad thing and they're like, oh, my bad. We shouldn't have done that.
In verse 21, they're like, hey, God, why would you wipe an entire Israelite tribe off the planet? And and it's like, wait, you did that.
Yeah.
You did that. God never told you to do that. I literally laughed. I was like, what do you mean, God, why would you? You did it. You got out of control.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it no longer was about no longer about justice, about vengeance.
Yep.
And when that hit, you went way too far.
Yep.
Way too far. Interesting.
And then, so what do they have to do to fix it?
Well, if they don't do something, these 600 men, because they made a rash vow, very similar to the Jephthah vow, very rash kind of vow. They made this vow that, well, none of us are going to let our women, our daughters, marry any Benjamin. Well, why would they do that? That was not necessary.
Yeah.
And so they made the vow, so now they're like stuck. Like
They have to live with it now.
They have to live with it. So they're like, okay, we have 600 Benjamin men. If we don't get them married off, literally Benjamin will no longer exist.
Yeah.
They just will no longer exist. So they have to do something. And they basically say, oh, there was this one group that didn't come out to fight, so they didn't make a vow. So let's go take their kid. Let's go take their women.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they do.
That's the people of Jabesh Gilead, right?
Yeah, for whatever reason, Gilead decides not to take the call. They do not become unified.
I think we'll read in Samuel that there's a relationship between the people of Jabesh Gilead and Benjamin. And so there is we haven't really been clued into it yet, but I think in Samuel and Saul's story we'll see that.
Interesting. So maybe that's why they didn't come unified to come against them.
Right. Sorry, they didn't go against the Benjamites because of the relationship, but you're right, Israel was mad at them because they didn't assemble with Israel, and there was also the vow of anybody that didn't assemble with us, we're going to go after them.
Yeah, so basically there's two vows happening. Two vows unnecessary.
And they try to use one to fix the other.
Fix the other one. It's so messed up.
That's the classic examples of humans trying to fix human failures through human logic.
Right. It's like bad plus bad doesn't equal good.
Man, that is spot on. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we try
That's exactly
sometimes.
what that is.
Yeah. So they go ahead and destroy these people, and they basically destroy everyone except for any virgin.
Yep.
And there were only 400 of them. That's a problem. How many Benjamins were left over? Benjamites?
600.
600 men. So we're left with 200 more that don't have women. What are we going to do now? So they come up with a new plan.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. I mean, this is negative plus negative plus negative.
So to make it worse, let's go to the city of God at this point, which is Shiloh.
Shiloh is where the tabernacle is.
Yeah.
So you have a festival, a celebration that happens yearly in the springtime, where it's kind of, I called it a bachelorette party, is what I call it, like a big giant bachelorette party. Well, basically in the spring, the people who are coming of age, women-wise, who can get married off, they come out and they dance and they celebrate basically all the girls come out and they're celebrating each other. I got married last year, it's been beautiful. You've come to age, you're going to marry off this year. And it's like this big of like what marriage is going to be like, right? This is what they want. They desire to grow up and then get married and have kids and do what God prepared them to do, which is to be blessed and multiply, right? And so you have this festival every year. Well, they know this festival happens. They're like, shh, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
You're going to go ambush and hide behind the bushes. And when the women come out dancing, you're going to kidnap them, take them back with you, and start a family.
And there's your wives.
Are you kidding me?
I mean, this is literally sexual trafficking.
This is kidnapping, trafficking, forced marriage.
Yeah.
What was it not? Is actually more like
That it's a violation of a human person's free will and making them a slave and taking away their life. But I think we will see that there were children out of these 600 Benjamites that were very consequential to the history of Israel because Saul is a Benjamite.
Yes, Saul
and he had
is a
to come
Benjamite.
from one of these 600.
So I thought it was really interesting that the book of Judges ends with the phrase we keep talking about.
Yeah.
It ends with, in those days there was no king in Israel. And we don't see another king until we see Saul.
Yep.
And I was like, oh, we don't see a king, you're right, until Saul. But Saul still isn't God's king.
Right.
They still Israel doing it their own way.
Yep.
And so I went and looked, and it not only is Saul, is a Benjamite, but he has to be a Benjamite from this marriage, one of these two, whether that be the 400 that's from the tribe that they slaughtered, or from these 200 where they went and kidnapped them in their festival time. Either way, he came from one of these marriages. And then then he comes up and becomes Saul. We know Saul's story. Well, maybe we don't, but we're going to get to it.
Yeah.
Shall we move to John?
Yep.
As we move to John, don't forget you are in Psalm 69 this week. It is a beautiful psalm. It's very uplifting, especially if you have anything in your life that you feel like you're struggling or feeling down, or it's just a very uplifting psalm. So I would encourage you to read that and enjoy that psalm. We just don't have time in our podcast to do that.
I think to do it justice would require its own episode.
It would,
as most psalms would anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But we're in John chapter 2 this week. I'm actually going to let you introduce this because you're going to actually relate it to something from the end of last week.
Yeah, so we only covered the first 18 verses of John 1 last week. And we're not going to focus much on John 1 this week, but I do want to cover a little bit of the last verses of John 1 because it really sets up John chapter 2 in awesome ways. John 2 and the rest of the Gospel of John, actually. So in verses 43 through the end of chapter 1, Jesus calls Philip and Nathanael. And when he's talking to Nathanael, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called, you were under a fig tree. I saw you." Mm-hmm. This really impresses Nathanael. And Jesus is like, "Oh, you think just because I said I saw you under a fig tree, you believe? Well, you think that's something, you're going to see greater things than these." And then he says the words that we read in the story of Jacob's ladder in Genesis.
Yep.
"Truly, truly, I say to you, you'll see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And so we get this sense of Jesus is going to be the new Jacob's ladder. He's going to be where heaven and earth come together. He's the new joining of God's place and God's presence with the human world.
Yeah.
And then we move into the first of 7 signs that John will give us in his gospel. We see the first of 7 signs at the wedding of Cana at the start of chapter 2.
So we're going to see 7 different signs or miracles throughout John. We're just going to introduce the first one here.
Yep.
We're going to build upon these 7 signs.
Yeah, because the 7 signs will each show a identity or an aspect of who Jesus is. And by the way, the same thing will happen with the 7 I am statements, which, spoiler alert, there's 7 I am statements later in the Gospel of John as well. We won't get to any of them this week. But we do start with the 7 signs, and as you said, we'll layer each on top of the other as we get to them. But the first one this week is going to show the first aspect of Jesus' mastery over the natural forces of creation. And in this sense, we see him turning the water in the 6, what do they call them, the 6 jars of purification for the Jewish rite of purification. One, there's 6 water jars, and I think you have a picture you'll post, but these Jewish rites of purification were to cleanse things before people went into the temple. They were also used in preparation for prayer or for the cleaning of oneself after coming into contact with something unclean in a Levitical sense.
Gotcha.
As we talked about, a Nazirite was supposed to stay away from unclean things like dead bodies. That would that would impart, symbolize the impartation of sin or the presence of sin. So you have to wash yourself
up.
before you go in the temple. That's what these jugs were used for. So there's water in these jugs that Jesus then turns into wine. Well, it shows his mastery over high quantities and of water, and then he also has a mastery over the quality of the substance of the created order, because he creates the water into the most excellent wine. You know, they say later, most people leave, the most hosts serve the good wine first and then serve the poor wine later, but you save the good wine for the last. And so that just shows that Jesus created the best wine that they had. And so this shows the word covers or has mastery over water, right? It has control over the water aspect of creation.
That's awesome. So that's number one.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting that the very first miracle here, the first sign that Jesus did, he was turning Mary asked him to turn water into wine. And the water was in these stone jars, like you said. The first temptation. So the temptation story would have happened right before this in the other Gospels. He was tempted after his baptism. And then this would have been the next story after that. The devil asked Jesus his first temptation. The devil asked him if he would turn the stones into bread.
Interesting.
And then here his mom, the first miracle, his mom, Mary, asks him to turn water into wine. I just thought that was really interesting.
I think this is almost an anti-temptation story. Like John is trying to, the temptations happen, but now we're going to start to reverse the effect of those.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
And speaking of his mother, did you catch that in chapter 4 where he calls her, verse 4 of chapter 2, and where he calls her woman? What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet arrived.
Yeah.
I think the hour is his time of crucifixion, because the next time we see Mary in the Gospel of John is in chapter 19 at the foot of the cross.
Yeah, so she's there again, and it is his final hour. I think you're exactly right on. In fact, I found that 7 times is going to say, this is not my hour, is not yet.
Another set of sevens.
There's another set of sevens. You know how much we love numbers around here and love sevens. 3 sets of sevens here. In each one of them, he's referencing the resurrection, and this is crucifixion is resurrection. So I think that's really interesting. Great imagery. I did not catch that Mary was in both of those, so I'm glad you did that. What else do we have? The only thing I wrote down here is that I like that it mentioned that the water was already to the brim. And the reason I think that is mentioned specifically is because we're supposed to imagine that Jesus didn't add anything to the water. If the water is already to the brim, he can't add something for it to turn into wine.
Right.
It is a transformation, not something being added to it.
That's a great point. And I think we have images of later Christian sacraments here, both the Lord's Supper, communion, combined with baptism.
Yeah.
The water and the wine.
Yes, of course.
I don't have much more to say about it than that, but it's just a beautiful union of the two aspects of the Christian sacramental life that the church lives out and displays.
So you see this thing happen. Everyone seems to see what's happening. Mary's asked. The disciples saw what's going on. The servants who actually did the work saw what happened. The bridegroom is pretty impressed with what happened, right? The guests seem to like the wine. Yeah. But at the very end, I was confused. This is a question for you. I didn't pre-warn you.
See how good I am.
All right. I thought it was interesting that it says in verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did in Galilee and manifest his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I wrote down, does this imply that others did not?
I think so. I think it would imply that, right? I think there's also a sense that these signs are given to elicit faith. And I think you've even pointed out in the last, maybe you said this last week, one of the last points of the Gospel of John was it John 20, where it says, why was this book written?
Yep, 20.
Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So I think all of his signs are for a sense of to elicit faith in those around him,
right,
and ultimately us through the power of the Spirit reading the Word.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And that's why I sort of asked that question, because I was like, it seems interesting that there's so many people who had eyes on what was happening, but yet it only seemed to say that the disciples believed in him. I just thought that. I think maybe pay attention. So as we see these different signs, what John says of who believed in.
Don't have Samson eyes, have eyes of the disciples of Jesus.
There you go.
Yeah.
I love it.
And
So keep going.
Then he cleanses the temple, which is interesting because I could have sworn in the Synoptic Gospels that the cleansing of the temple was at the end of the Gospel. And more than that, he didn't enter the Jerusalem at all until the last week of his life in the other Gospels.
Yeah, is that
But
interesting?
here all that's happening at the beginning of this Gospel.
Is it the same time, just John's reversing it, or is it a totally different time?
It's a good question. I was confused. What do you think? I
would like to think.
I thought the Synoptic Gospels had this reversed. So what do you think is John doing here?
I would like to lean towards the fact that this is a totally different instance. This is not the same story, and I think the reason why is because the Synoptic Gospels do not mention the whip and some other things that are happening, and so I wouldn't I wouldn't put it past Jesus that at the beginning of his ministry he would enter Jerusalem and he would claim his authority.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it past Jesus, even though the other Gospels, for whatever reason, who they're writing to and the reasons that they're writing it didn't need to have it. But John does. He's saying who Jesus is. He's already saying he has authority.
I think we already said John's Gospel is more about the identity of Jesus
Correct.
as opposed to his public ministry,
Right.
like the Synoptic Gospels are. So I think you're right on. He's going into Jerusalem to claim who he is,
Yeah.
to show who he is. Even the response of the Jews, it says the Jews in verse 18, but which, by the way, at least in John, I didn't research this in other Gospels, but at least in John, when it translates as Jews, it's really more appropriate to translate Judeans, the people of Judea.
Gotcha.
And many times it's the Jewish or Judean leaders.
Right.
So it's not whitewashing all of Jews when it says the Jews.
Sure.
We have a lot of anti-Semitism in church history, so we just want to be sensitive to that. But when they say, what sign do you show us for doing these things, that sign is, when they're asking for the sign of that you're going to give us to show us why you're doing these things, they're asking for what his authority is. By what authority are you doing these? And we talked about his authority. His shmika is the Hebrew word, and we talked about that a few weeks ago in Luke, so I won't revisit it here. But Jesus has his authority to do these things from God and from his baptism, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And his impartation of authority, at least in some sense, from John the Baptist.
Yes. So a few weeks ago, you said you're not going to do it. I'm going to do it anyways.
Okay.
So
a
few weeks ago, we reviewed the fact that they believe that a rabbi's authority had to come from another rabbi, and then so we said that was probably John in the baptism, and then the ultimate authority, obviously the voice of God coming straight after the baptism. So he's been given authority, and then he immediately does his first miracle, and then he hears going in Jerusalem and saying, "I have authority here."
And then, as if to double down on his identity, he says, "Well, I'll show you my sign. It'll be when this temple is destroyed. I'll go rebuild it, raise it up in 3 days."
Yeah.
He says, "Raise it up."
And what is he talking about there?
He's talking about the fact that he is the new temple. His resurrection of himself in 3 days is him becoming the new temple. The old temple is redundant at best, and eventually it will be destroyed in 70 AD.
Exactly right.
To go back to verse 12 and 13 a little bit, real quick. In verse 12, he goes from Cana, the wedding in Cana, he goes to Capernaum. I'm going to post a map real quick. He's in the region of Galilee here. And Cana to Capernaum, I think my notes said it's 16 miles. But you'll see he's going up towards the upper arm of the Sea of Galilee. But then he stays there, but then the very next verse, he goes all the way down to Jerusalem. My little map of Galilee doesn't show Jerusalem because Jerusalem is all the way down south of Samaria into Judea. And so he travels a long way down there. So that's kind of what makes me wonder if John is kind of taking the cleansing the temple, which might have happened at the end of his ministry, and putting it at the first for theological reasons. I don't know that, I'm not saying that. But Jesus is all over the map in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, sure.
He's all over Judea and Samaria, and somewhat into the Decapolis, which you'll see off to the eastern side. But he's just all over the place, and there's less of a sense of ordered travel that you have that feel in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You have less of that sense in John. It's just more about the theological points John is trying to make in the telling of the gospel. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a real reason to do that. But if you get confused by that the locations are not the point and the sequencing is not the point as much as what we're trying to the case we're trying to build to say about Jesus and who he is.
I love that. I think that's exactly what I was going to summarize what you just said. Pay attention as you're reading. If you feel like you're getting stuck on maybe location or timing or why is he here and then there, John wrote this very differently. His purpose is very, very different. So don't get stuck. Trust the process. Realize that John is trying to speak a very specific message about who Jesus is, and it's less about this ministry perfect line of from getting to point A to point B.
So it's not a newspaper report of what happened in the news last night. This is not that.
This is not that at all. So pay attention. If you start feeling stuck, it's okay to feel stuck. Just don't get there stuck for long, and trust it and keep reading. And I think it will come to light for you.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us every single week. I know I am so blessed.
Me too. I get a lot out of these discussions and just digging into the Word with you.
Same. And as we finished up our 8th book together, I'm looking forward as we are working on our next books together. So we have Ruth coming up.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. I think we'll see a breath of fresh air in the midst of all the darkness of having just been through Judges and before we enter 1 Samuel. We'll spoiler alert, we'll start to see what it looks like when we do things right and when we follow God's ways. Exactly.
I think this is a great timing for this because we've been saying about how when the leadership is corrupt and leadership is bad, it trickles down a lot, but that doesn't lose all hope. Right. There is still enter Ruth. Like there's still a few people out there who are still following God and still doing it right. And I love that this book is right here. So we're going to enter that next week. But until then, God bless you, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye, y'all.